Across centuries and continents, civilizations have risen to remarkable heights, only to vanish suddenly, leaving behind cities, monuments, and echoes of lives abruptly ended. From the sun-baked streets of Babylon to the frozen cliffs of Mesa Verde, from the ash-covered ruins of Pompeii to the modern ghost city of Pripyat, these collapses defy expectation and leave historians, archaeologists, and observers questioning how so much could disappear so quickly. In this documentary, we explore the swift fall of extraordinary civilizations, examining the forces natural, human, and sometimes inexplicable that brought them to an abrupt end. Each story offers a window into a world that once thrived, where daily life, trade, art, and ritual existed in full vibrancy until the moment everything changed. Step into the haunting remains, abandoned streets, and silent monuments that testify to civilizations disappearing without warning. Akrotiri, buried in fire and ash. The island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea once held a city that seemed destined to last forever. Known today as Akrotiri, it stood as one of the jewels of the Minoan world, filled with narrow streets, multi-story houses, and walls painted with bright murals. Archaeologists have uncovered images of blue monkeys, lilies, and scenes of ships sailing the seas, all painted nearly 600 years ago. The city was alive with colour and culture, its people trading with Crete, Cyprus, and Egypt. Yet all of it ended in an instant when the earth beneath the island shook and the volcano at its heart erupted with a force few could imagine. The eruption of Thera, as the volcano is called, was one of the largest in recorded history. Around the 16th century BCE, the island exploded in stages, with earthquakes coming first. For those who lived in Akrotiri, the tremors must have been terrifying, but not unfamiliar, as earthquakes were a part of life in the region. What they could not know was that these were only the warning signs. Ash began to fall like grey snow, coating rooftops and clogging the air. Entire buildings collapsed as the ground shook again and again. The city, once filled with the voices of merchants and children, fell silent under clouds of choking dust. What makes Akrotiri so haunting is how suddenly it was sealed away. Much like Pompeii centuries later, the eruption buried everything under layers of pumice and volcanic debris. Streets were frozen in time, with jars of olives still intact and furniture preserved. Archaeologists even found advanced drainage systems and clay pipes, showing that this was no simple village, but a sophisticated city. Yet, curiously, almost no human remains have been found. This has led to theories that the people managed to flee before the final blasts, boarding ships and leaving their homes behind in desperation. If they did, their escape was into a sea soon overwhelmed by massive tsunamis. The scale of destruction reached far beyond Santorini itself. Waves as high as 30 meters are thought to have swept across the Aegean, smashing into the northern coast of Crete. At the time, Crete was the center of the Minoan civilization, and many historians believe this disaster dealt a blow from which they never fully recovered. Palaces like Knossos survived the waves, but trade networks collapsed, farmland was poisoned by ash, and famine followed. Some scholars even connect the fall of the Minoans to this eruption, linking Akrotiri's sudden end to the decline of one of the greatest cultures of the Bronze Age. The site of Akrotiri today is eerie. Excavations have revealed entire neighborhoods beneath protective shelters, their walls still rising several meters high. Staircases lead nowhere, doorways open into empty rooms, and fragments of painted plaster lie where they fell nearly 4,000 years ago. Unlike most ruins, which crumble slowly over centuries, Akrotiri feels as though its people stepped away only yesterday. The ash preserved even delicate objects like woven baskets and wooden beds. It is this sense of an instant pause, of life interrupted mid-step, that makes the site so unsettling. Legends may also echo the memory of the eruption. Some have suggested that the story of Atlantis, told by Plato 1,000 years later, was inspired by the destruction of Santorini, a powerful island civilization, rich and advanced, swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. It mirrors what happened at Akrotiri with uncanny detail. While no one can say for certain whether the Atlantis tale is directly linked, the scale of the disaster left a mark that must have been remembered in myths across the Mediterranean. Standing among the ruins, one can imagine the final hours. Families rushing through the narrow streets, the ground shuddering beneath their feet. Ash is turning the midday sky to darkness. The smell of sulfur is heavy in the air. Perhaps some clung to the hope of return, leaving treasured items behind in the belief they would one day come back, but no one did. The city lay entombed until modern excavations began in 1967, when archaeologists peeled back the ash and uncovered its haunting stillness. Akrotiri remains a snapshot of a civilization that ended in fire and ash. It is both a warning and a memory, showing how suddenly a city can vanish when nature unleashes its power. One day, it was alive with art, trade, and laughter. The next, it was gone, buried beneath the weight of the earth itself. The silence that followed lasted for millennia, until modern hands uncovered its story again. Pompeii and Herculaneum, the frozen hours. The morning of August 24th in the year 79 CE began as any other for the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The streets of Pompeii were already filling with merchants setting up their stalls, bakers tending ovens, and families moving through their daily routines. Few could have suspected that within a single day, both cities would be struck from the map, their lives ended and preserved in ways the world had never seen before. It began with a sound that rolled across the bay, a deep roar rising from Mount Vesuvius. At first, it looked like a pillar of smoke climbing high into the sky, but soon the column of ash, pumice, and fire darkened the daylight itself. Residents of Pompeii watched in confusion as hot stones rained down, smashing roofs and filling the streets ankle-deep. Herculaneum, closer to the mountain, was covered by a shower of black ash so dense that the midday sun disappeared and the air became almost impossible to breathe. Panic spread quickly. Families gathered what they could carry and tried to flee. In Pompeii, many ran toward the city gates, pushing against the falling debris. Others remained indoors, believing thick walls would protect them from the storm outside. Hours passed, and the rain of pumice grew heavier. Roofs collapsed under the weight, crushing those who had sought shelter. Streets became impassable, and the desperate cries of neighbors echoed through the darkened city. What happened in Herculaneum was even more sudden. In the early evening, the eruption's fury shifted. A wall of scorching gas and ash, known today as a pyroclastic surge, raced down the slopes at terrifying speed. In an instant, it reached Herculaneum, filling the city with superheated air that killed nearly everyone within seconds. Later, surges buried the town under layers of volcanic material more than 60 feet deep. Archaeologists centuries later found their remains along the shoreline, huddled in stone boathouses where they had sought safety, their last moments preserved in haunting detail. Through the night, the disaster only grew worse. In Pompeii, some managed to escape across the countryside, carrying children and clutching small belongings as the sky thundered with fire, but tens of thousands were trapped. By the early morning hours, pyroclastic flows thundered into the city, flooding streets and filling homes with searing ash. In a matter of minutes, Pompeii became a tomb. Bodies were left in the positions of their final moments, some shielding loved ones, others covering their faces as the air grew unbreathable. When the eruption finally ended, both Pompeii and Herculaneum were gone. The once thriving towns were buried beneath millions of tons of volcanic rock. Survivors who fled never returned to rebuild. The land was too dangerous, and the memory of what had happened too heavy to bear. Over time, the very locations of the cities were forgotten, their names living only in scattered records. 17 centuries later, when excavations began in earnest, the world was confronted with the frozen hours of that day. Loaves of bread were still in ovens, and frescoes still clung to plastered walls, their colours surprisingly bright. But what gripped the imagination most were the voids left where human bodies had decayed. Archaeologists filled these spaces with plaster, creating haunting casts of men, women, and children, captured in their last moments, arms raised, knees bent, faces frozen in panic or prayer. Herculaneum gave up a different picture. The volcanic material preserved wood, textiles, and even food in remarkable condition. Wooden furniture, roof beams, and papyrus scrolls survived, carbonized but intact. Yet the most haunting discovery lay along the ancient shoreline, where the skeletons of more than 300 people were found together. They had gathered in the boathouses, waiting for rescue by sea, unaware that death would come not from water, but from the fire racing down the mountain. Today, walking through the remains of these cities, the silence is unsettling. The stone streets are still lined with houses, shops, and public buildings, but the voices are gone. The suddenness of their end lingers in every plaster cast and every empty doorway. Unlike ruins that crumble slowly through time, Pompeii and Herculaneum were sealed in the exact hour of their destruction, preserved not by chance, but by catastrophe. It was not only the end of two cities. The eruption of Vesuvius carried far greater weight. It was the freezing of a single day in history, captured with brutal clarity. What makes it so haunting is not only the violence of the event, but how ordinary life was preserved beside it: a baker's bread, a child's toy, a painted wall. Together, they form a reminder of how fragile civilization can be and how swiftly a single morning can become the last. Helike, the city swallowed by the sea. Along the coast of ancient Greece, there once stood a city that commanded power and respect, a place where temples rose high above the land and citizens honored their gods with pride. This was Helike, a thriving city of Achaia, remembered for its devotion to Poseidon, the god of the sea. For centuries, it prospered, its influence reaching across the Gulf of Corinth, its name carried by travelers and traders alike. Yet one winter's night in 373 BCE, Helike was struck by a disaster so sudden and complete that it seemed the earth itself had turned against it. In the days leading up to the catastrophe, unusual signs were said to have appeared. Ancient writers described animals fleeing the city, snakes and rats leaving in droves, as if they sensed the coming danger. The citizens, however, carried on as normal. Markets stayed open, fishermen returned with their catches, and priests continued their rituals within the sacred temple of Poseidon. The sea was calm, and the air gave no hint of what was about to happen. Then, as darkness fell, the ground beneath Helike began to convulse. Tremors shook the walls of houses, sending tiles and stones tumbling into the street. Cracks split open, swallowing people where they stood. Within moments, a massive earthquake tore through the city, toppling temples and flattening homes. Survivors must have cried out in confusion, but their terror was only beginning. From the gulf came a roar unlike anything they had heard before, and a wall of water surged inland. The tsunami swept across Helike with devastating force, crashing through what the earthquake had spared. Entire neighborhoods were dragged into the sea. Ships anchored near the shore were hurled far inland, smashing into buildings before being pulled back into the depths. Those who had escaped the falling stones now found themselves fighting to keep their heads above the waves, only to be swept away by the black waters. In less than a night, Helike ceased to exist, its people drowned or buried beneath mud and debris. The destruction was so total that nearby cities spoke of Helike as if it had vanished from the face of the earth. Heraclea, just a short distance away, could do nothing to help. When morning came, there was no city left to save. Ancient accounts tell us that the sea covered the land completely, and fishermen claimed they could still see the tops of buildings glinting beneath the waves for years afterward. The great temple of Poseidon, once the pride of the city, lay submerged, its statue standing eerily in the water. Sailors avoided the area, fearing the wrath of the god to whom the city had once prayed. News of the disaster spread quickly across Greece. Writers like Strabo and Diodorus recorded the story, treating it as a warning of divine punishment. For the Greeks, the fall of Helike became more than a natural disaster. It was seen as a lesson in hubris, the belief that human power could never outmatch the forces of the earth and sea. Plato himself writing not long after, may have heard of Helik's fate. Some scholars believe that tales of this city swallowed by the ocean could have fed into his account of Atlantis, another place said to have vanished in a single night. For ages, the name of Helik lived on in stories, even as the city itself had vanished. The land where it once stood changed with time, rivers shifting and coastlines retreating, until no one could say for sure where the city had been. It was not until the late 20th century that archaeologists finally uncovered its remains, buried beneath layers of sediment in what is now a coastal plain. Excavations revealed pottery, coins stamped with the head of Poseidon, and foundations of buildings long hidden beneath the earth. Walking across the site today, it is hard to picture the city that once dominated the region. The earthquake and tsunami not only destroyed its buildings, but also erased its very memory from the landscape. What is left is a place of silence, where fragments of walls rise out of the soil, reminders of a single night when nature reshaped the land. Unlike ruins that fall slowly over centuries, Helik was taken in a moment, its people and culture lost before they had time to understand what was happening. The memory of Helik shows that what seems unshakable can still collapse without warning. One evening, it was filled with light and life, and by morning, it was nothing more than a name whispered in fear and awe. The sea that had once given it trade and wealth became the instrument of its destruction, leaving behind a cautionary tale that echoes through history. The fall of Babylon in a single night. The walls of Babylon once stood as the very symbol of power, towering over the Mesopotamian plain with a presence so imposing that travelers believed no force on earth could ever bring them down. Within those walls, the city's people lived with a sense of permanence, surrounded by temples, markets, and palaces that seemed destined to endure for eternity. The Euphrates River cut directly through the city, a lifeline that gave Babylon both prosperity and a false sense of invincibility. For generations, stories of its grandeur spread far beyond its borders, cementing its reputation as one of the great wonders of the ancient world. Yet the night came when everything changed, when its power collapsed in a span so brief that later accounts spoke of its downfall as happening in a single stroke of fate. Pressure had already gripped Babylon in the days before the event. The Persian army, under Cyrus the Great, had already swept across Mesopotamia, toppling kingdoms that had once challenged Babylon's dominance. Though some within the city whispered of defeat, most citizens carried on as though the walls, thick enough for chariots to ride across, would always keep them safe. Guards patrolled the massive gates, and life within the city continued with feasts, prayers, and celebrations, as if no enemy could breach the heart of their empire. There was a confidence in the air, but it was the kind born not from strength, but from a dangerous underestimation of the threat waiting just beyond the horizon. Accounts describe a night when the Babylonians gathered for a festival, drinking and rejoicing within the safety of their walls. While the city indulged in its revelry, the Persians made their move. Knowing the defenses were impenetrable by sheer force, Cyrus relied on strategy rather than brute strength. His army diverted the course of the Euphrates, lowering the river until its flow through Babylon's channels was shallow enough for soldiers to march across. Instead of battering down gates or climbing impossible heights, the Persians simply entered through the waterway, slipping quietly into the city that had boasted of eternal security. Imagine the confusion as soldiers walked the streets unnoticed at first, their footsteps blending with the noise of music and drunken laughter. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the Persians were already at the heart of the city. Panic spread too late to rally a defense. The mighty walls, so often praised as unconquerable, stood useless as the enemy flooded inside from the one place no one expected. For the people of Babylon, the end arrived not with a drawn-out battle, but with the sudden realization that their city had already been lost. The stories told later speak of Belshazzar, the Babylonian ruler at the time, caught unaware during a banquet. One account describes how writing appeared on the wall during the feast, a cryptic warning that no one could interpret until the invasion revealed its meaning. Whether this tale was history embellished with prophecy or simply legend woven afterward, it captured the essence of what happened. A kingdom that believed itself untouchable collapsed in the span of one night, leaving behind a lesson in how arrogance blinds even the most powerful rulers. When morning came, the city that once held the Hanging Gardens and the great ziggurat of Marduk belonged to the Persians. Babylon's streets were littered with the remnants of abandoned celebrations, half-finished meals, and the stunned silence of a people who had woken up to find their world overturned. Some surrendered without resistance, while others struggled to understand how the end had come so swiftly, bypassing every defense they trusted. The empire that had boasted of dominion over all was now absorbed into a greater one, its independence vanishing as quickly as the waters that had been redirected to destroy it. The fall of Babylon remains one of history's most striking examples of how even the mightiest civilizations can crumble in an instant. It was not centuries of decline or years of siege that ended its reign, but a single night of misplaced confidence and clever strategy. The walls remained standing for years after, but the power that had once filled them was gone. What lingered was the memory of how a city that seemed eternal could vanish almost without a fight, swallowed not by fire or flood, but by its own unshakable belief that nothing could ever bring it down. Persepolis, a capital in flames. The Persian kings built Persepolis not only as a royal seat, but as a stage where the empire's power could be displayed in stone, carved reliefs, and towering columns that seemed to reach into the sky. The terraces rose from the plain like a crafted mountain, and staircases led to halls lined with images of tribute bearers, soldiers, and animals, all testifying to the vastness of the empire. Every detail was meant to show order, wealth, and control. On certain days of the year, delegations came from across the known world to bring gifts to the great king, walking past the colossal gates guarded by stone bulls and entering into the throne room where gold and silver gleamed in the light of torches. For nearly 2 centuries, Persepolis stood as the physical heart of Persia's royal identity, a place where authority seemed unshakable. But in 330 BCE, that sense of permanence unraveled in a single night of destruction. Alexander of Macedon had already defeated the Persian armies in the field, and his march into the empire's core was swift and relentless. When he reached Persepolis, the city surrendered, knowing resistance was impossible. The Macedonian soldiers entered a city still full of treasures, gold, silver, textiles, and fine objects stored for generations in the royal treasury. To the conquerors, Persepolis was the symbol of everything Persian kings had used to intimidate and rule the world. To the Persians themselves, it was sacred, tied to their identity and memory. At first, Alexander treated the city with caution. The vast wealth inside the treasury was taken and catalogued, a fortune so immense that chroniclers would later struggle to put its value into words. His men, many of whom had been fighting and marching for years, were allowed to rest within the city, yet beneath the surface, resentment lingered. Greek writers spoke of the Persian invasions of earlier centuries, of the burning of Athens, and of a hatred that had not been forgotten. Some accounts say it was revenge that drove what happened next, while others suggest it was born from a night of drunken revelry. In one version of the story, Alexander and his generals feasted with courtesans and friends, the great halls filled with music and laughter echoing through the carved stone. Wine flowed, and words turned into challenges, daring him to show that he could undo Persia in its very heart. Someone suggested setting fire to the palace, an act of symbolic vengeance that would erase the memory of Persian dominance. Whether from pride, anger, or intoxication, Alexander agreed. Torches were lit, and flames were carried into the wooden structures that supported the grand palace of Xerxes. The fire spread quickly, climbing from timber to timber, consuming the roofs and leaping onto the great cedar beams. Soon, the brilliance of Persepolis was drowned in the roar of flames and the glow of destruction. Reliefs that had stood for generations cracked and crumbled as heat warped the stone. Roofs collapsed under the weight of the inferno, sending sparks spiraling into the night. For those who watched from the plain below, It must have seemed as though the gods themselves had turned against the city. The Macedonians later tried to put the fire out, but the destruction was too far gone. By morning, Persepolis was a ruin, blackened and hollow, where once it had been filled with treasure and ceremony. Some of its great staircases and stone carvings survived, scarred but still standing, silent witnesses to the night the city was reduced to ash. The Persians saw it as an act of humiliation, a deliberate erasure of their identity, while even some Greeks believed Alexander had gone too far, destroying a city that could have been a jewel of his empire. In the years that followed, Persepolis was never rebuilt. Unlike other conquered cities that found new life under different rulers, this capital remained a husk, its ruins left to be slowly buried by time. Travelers who passed through in later centuries spoke of broken columns rising from the earth, of a place haunted by the memory of kings and the arrogance of a conqueror who, in one night, chose fire over preservation. The striking nature of Persepolis' downfall lies as much in its symbolism as in its suddenness. It was not swallowed by an earthquake or drowned by the sea. It was deliberately erased, its splendor turned into a cautionary tale of how even the grandest achievements can vanish when pride and vengeance outweigh wisdom. Today, the surviving ruins still rise against the Iranian sky, a reminder of both the empire's strength and the single night when flames brought it down. Nineveh's swift collapse. To the Assyrians, Nineveh itself had seemed unshakable, its massive walls stretching for miles and wide enough for chariots to ride along the top. Yet when the end came, it was not a slow decline, but a sudden and violent undoing of everything they had built. Inside the city, life moved as it always had, merchants filling the markets, scribes recording taxes, and priests tending to their temples. But far beyond those walls, as an alliance was forming, one that would gather the Babylonians and the Medes together against the heart of Assyria. For years, the empire had expanded through conquest, leaving resentment in its wake, and when the chance came to strike at the capital itself, the enemies of Nineveh did not hesitate. The siege began with confidence on both sides, for the Assyrians had withstood countless attacks before, and their defences were considered unmatched. Yet the attackers came with patience, knowing that the longer they held their ground, the more the defenders would weaken. Food within the city began to grow scarce, and the once proud inhabitants who had ruled over Mesopotamia for generations found themselves shut in, waiting and hoping that their walls would hold. The clay tablets that have survived from those days describe fear spreading among the people, even as their king tried to rally them with promises of divine favour. The Euphrates and Tigris had always been lifelines for the city, but now the rivers became tools of destruction. Accounts suggest that heavy rains swelled the rivers during the siege, softening the earth beneath the fortifications. The enemy, seeing their chance, diverted waters and turned nature itself into a weapon. Where stone and brick had resisted battering rams and flaming arrows, water did what armies alone could not, loosening foundations until parts of the mighty walls collapsed. When the breaches opened, the attackers surged in, and what had seemed unshakable became suddenly exposed. The streets filled with chaos as soldiers poured through, cutting down those who resisted and driving survivors deeper into the city's heart. The king, Sine-Shar-Ishkun, faced the unthinkable as he realized his city could not be saved. Some say he died in the fighting, refusing to flee, while others record that he set fire to his own palace so that neither he nor his treasures would be taken alive. Flames rose into the sky, smoke rolling over the rooftops, while the clash of steel and the cries of the dying echoed through streets that had once displayed the spoils of Assyrian conquests. Statues that had been carried from faraway lands now fell, toppled and broken, and the carved reliefs that once told of victory over others became part of the rubble of defeat. The Allies showed no mercy, for the memory of Assyrian cruelty still burned in their minds. Towns and kingdoms once crushed under Assyrian campaigns had not forgotten the brutal deportations, the impalements, and the heavy tributes demanded year after year. Now vengeance came swiftly, and Nineveh became its stage. Temples were looted, palaces plundered, and whatever could be carried away was taken. The rest was consumed in fire, leaving only charred remains of halls that had once dazzled with ivory and gold. Archaeologists digging centuries later found blackened walls, collapsed ceilings, and treasures left behind not because they were spared, but because they were destroyed in the collapse. What shocked those who later heard of Nineveh's fate was not only the destruction itself, but how quickly an empire that had ruled for centuries unraveled in a single moment. Poets and prophets of the time described the city's downfall with almost eerie satisfaction, calling it a warning that no power, however great, could last forever. In the aftermath, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist as a dominant force, and its territories were divided among those who had risen against it. A city that had once been the heart of one of the most formidable powers in history was reduced to ruins, buried by time and silence. For centuries afterward, travelers and historians spoke of Nineveh almost as if it were a legend, a warning wrapped in stone. The once bright city of kings, where scribes had catalogued the world and armies had marched to victory after victory, became a memory beneath the soil. The swiftness of its fall remained the most haunting detail, for Nineveh had not dwindled into obscurity, but had instead been torn down in a sudden storm of steel, fire, and water. What had taken generations to build was lost in a matter of days, and the echoes of that collapse would linger long after the walls themselves had crumbled. Roanoke, the colony that vanished. When English settlers first arrived on Roanoke Island in the late 16th century, their goal was not only survival, but also the creation of a permanent foothold in the New World. They built homes from timber, planted crops, and tried to foster ties with the Algonquian-speaking tribes around them. Life was difficult from the start, with limited supplies, uncertain harvests, and the constant pressure of being far removed from England's support. Still, there was a sense of determination among them, a belief that the colony could thrive despite the hardships. That belief, however, would soon be overshadowed by a mystery that still lingers centuries later. John White, the colony's governor, made the difficult decision to return to England in 1587 to request additional provisions and reinforcements. The journey across the Atlantic was slow, and when he finally reached London, he was met with delays beyond his control. War with Spain had erupted, and England's ships were needed for defence rather than supply missions. White pressed for aid, but his appeals were constantly pushed aside. The years slipped away, and the colonists of Roanoke were left to fend for themselves without any word of when or if help would arrive. It was not until 1590 that White finally returned to Roanoke. After 3 years away, he approached the island with the hope of reunion, of finding his family and fellow settlers waiting to greet him. But as he stepped onto the land where the colony had once stood, he was met with silence. Houses had been dismantled, gardens overgrown, and the signs of daily life erased. The village appeared deserted, as though every soul had vanished without leaving behind a single trace of struggle or farewell. There was only one clue carved into a wooden post, the word Crotone. White knew this referred to a nearby island, home to an allied native group with whom the settlers had once had contact. To him, it seemed a deliberate message, a sign that the colonists had chosen to relocate. He wanted to follow the lead immediately, to sail toward Croatoan and confirm the fate of the missing settlers, but storms and dwindling supplies forced his ship back to England. He never had the chance to search again, and the trail went cold almost as soon as it appeared. The fate of the colonists quickly became a subject of speculation. Some suggested they may have starved and succumbed to the harsh conditions. Others believed they had been attacked by rival tribes, leaving no one alive to tell the story. A more enduring theory was that they assimilated with local native communities, adopting their ways in exchange for safety and survival. Oral histories among certain tribes later hinted at pale-skinned members joining their ranks, though no conclusive evidence was ever found. Archaeological efforts in more recent centuries have only deepened the mystery. Small discoveries, fragments of pottery, European tools buried in unexpected places, remains of settlements far from the original site suggest that some of the colonists may have moved inland. Yet the findings are scattered and incomplete, offering hints without delivering answers. The absence of definitive proof has made Roanoke stand out not just as a failed colony, but as one of the greatest unsolved disappearances in early American history. Its haunting quality deepens with one detail. White's own granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was among the settlers, the first English child born in the New World. Her name became woven into legends and folklore, with some tales describing her transformation into a ghostly figure wandering the forests, a symbol of the lost colony itself. While such stories carry no historical weight, they reveal how deeply the disappearance resonated with those who came after, turning Roanoke into both a tragedy and a myth. The English crown never again established a permanent settlement on Roanoke Island. Instead, their ambitions shifted further north, eventually leading to the creation of Jamestown years later. Yet the unanswered questions surrounding Roanoke remained, a shadow over the promise of colonization. Each attempt to explain the vanishing has only highlighted how little is truly known. More than 4 centuries have passed since John White stood on the abandoned site, staring at the single word etched into wood, and still the silence of Roanoke speaks louder than any explanation. It is a reminder that not all stories end with clarity, and that sometimes entire communities can vanish, leaving behind only fragments of possibility. The colony that was meant to be England's first lasting claim in the New World instead became a story of disappearance, a question that continues to echo with every retelling. Ubar, Atlantis of the Sands. Travelers who once crossed the vast deserts of southern Arabia spoke of a magnificent city hidden beyond the dunes, a place of soaring towers and endless riches, where caravans carrying frankincense and spices would pause before continuing on to distant markets. They called it Ubar, and for centuries it lingered more in whispered tales than in verified maps, described as a city so blessed with wealth that it seemed almost touched by myth. Yet those same stories carried a warning that arrogance and corruption had brought about its downfall, leaving nothing but sand where a thriving community once stood. When accounts first spread through medieval writers and explorers, they painted Ubar as an oasis of luxury, rising improbably in one of the harshest landscapes on earth. The city was said to be governed by powerful leaders who controlled the flow of incense, a commodity so valued in the ancient world that it was exchanged like gold in faraway Rome and Greece. From this wealth, Ubar grew into a name carried across continents, admired and envied in equal measure. But along with prosperity came decline, and the oral histories of the Bedouin told of a time when Ubar's rulers grew cruel, ignoring the natural limits of the land around them. Wells that had sustained travelers for generations were drawn down too quickly, and fragile grazing lands began to collapse into barren stretches of desert. Sometime in antiquity, according to the stories passed down, the city quite literally fell into the earth, swallowed by a collapse that turned stone into rubble and homes into dust. The sands swept in quickly, leaving only faint traces behind, and for centuries, Ubar was regarded as little more than a legend, a Middle Eastern counterpart to Atlantis. Western explorers in the 19th century began to take the tale more seriously. Charles Doughty and later Bertram Thomas, both fascinated by Arabia's interior, gathered stories from nomadic tribes who still spoke of the Iram of the Pillars, a phrase tied to passages in the Quran describing a city that disobeyed divine command and was destroyed as punishment. Thomas believed such legends hinted at a real settlement, perhaps a hub of incense trade lost in shifting sands. His suspicions encouraged more research, but it remained guesswork, as the desert's immensity concealed whatever ruins might exist. The breakthrough came in the 20th century, when satellite imaging and ground surveys revealed anomalies beneath the desert floor in Oman's Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. Archaeologists discovered remains of a fortified settlement near the village of Shiza, complete with collapsed limestone caverns beneath it. This site matched descriptions of a city that had suddenly given way, its heavy walls destabilizing the soft ground. Radiocarbon dating and pottery fragments suggested an occupation that extended back thousands of years, aligning with the incense trade's flourishing period. Although debate continues as to whether Shisra was Ubar itself or one of several key trading centers, the discovery gave sudden weight to the old legends. The collapse of the site seems to have been both sudden and irreversible. Limestone beneath the fortress eroded into massive sinkholes, undermining the foundations until entire sections of wall and tower dropped into darkness. Once the wells were destroyed, the water supply was lost, forcing survivors to abandon what remained. In the span of a single event, Ubar shifted from thriving center to ghostly ruin, remembered only in stories and fragments. Today, Ubar's reputation lives on more in imagination than in stone, but the partial excavations at Shisra have allowed scholars to connect myth with evidence. Carved walls, shards of pottery, and the outlines of watchtowers speak of a community deeply linked to trade and wealth, yet vulnerable to the harsh landscape it sought to master. Tourists who visit the region stand on dunes, where legends say entire streets once stretched, and look into sinkholes that seem bottomless, reminders of how fragile even the grandest constructions can be. The story of Ubar continues to haunt because it sits on the boundary between fact and legend, a city elevated into myth because of the dramatic nature of its fall. The desert gave life through trade routes and water, and then, with a single shift, took everything away. Whether called the Atlantis of the Sands, Iram of the Pillars, or simply Ubar, it remains a warning that wealth and permanence are illusions, and that nature, in its silence and vastness, holds the power to erase entire civilizations in a moment. Thonis Heraklion, Egypt's lost port. For centuries, sailors whispered of a city that once stood proudly at the edge of the Nile Delta, where the river's waters met the Mediterranean, a place filled with bustling harbours, towering temples, and markets alive with goods from every corner of the known world. That city was Thonis Heraklion, a vital Egyptian port that connected the riches of the Nile Valley to the wider seas. In its prime, it was not only a hub for trade, but also for religion, where travellers offered tribute to temples of gods like Amun and Heracles, hoping for safe passage across unpredictable waters. Everything about it suggested permanence, yet its survival was far more fragile than anyone at the time realized. Thonis Heraklion thrived as ships brought in grain, papyrus, and gold to be exchanged for wine, oil, and other goods that flowed from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond. Pilgrims flocked to the grand temple of Amun-Goreb, where ceremonies linked the pharaohs with the gods, binding politics to divinity. It was a place where religion, commerce, and governance blended into a seamless identity. Its streets alive with merchants calling out prices, scribes recording transactions, and priests preparing for rituals that would echo through the stone halls late into the night. The Nile Delta, however, is not a stable landscape. Its soil shifts and sinks, constantly reshaped by the river's branching channels and the pressure of waterlogged earth. Over time, parts of the city began to show signs of unease, with buildings tilting ever so slightly and foundations groaning under their own weight. Earthquakes rattled the coast, sending tremors through structures not built to withstand them, and tidal surges sometimes swept through the streets during storms. People built, prayed, and traded, unaware that the ground beneath them was weakening with every passing generation. Then came the breaking point. Though records of the exact moment are lost, evidence suggests a catastrophic combination of earthquake and flood triggered the city's collapse. Whole districts gave way as liquefaction of the soil, the sudden turning of solid earth into something like quicksand, caused temples, houses, and docks to sink into the waters. Statues weighing several tons, once raised to honor gods and rulers, toppled and disappeared beneath the waves, their immense weight dragging entire foundations down with them. Ships anchored in the harbor would have been tossed aside or swallowed whole, and within a short period, much of Thonis Heraklion was gone, buried beneath the sea, where it remained hidden for more than 1,000 years. In later centuries, travelers and chroniclers spoke of the city as if it were a legend, some confusing it with other coastal settlements, others dismissing it altogether as myth. Its memory faded, overshadowed by Alexandria, which rose to dominate the region after its founding by Alexander the Great. What had once been a centerpiece of Egypt's maritime identity became nothing more than a story, a name in old texts that few believed had any basis in reality. The sea had swallowed Thonis Heracleion whole, and for over a millennium it was as though it had never existed. It was only in the year 2000, when underwater archaeologists began exploring off the coast of modern-day Abruptly Bay, that the city's ruins re-emerged into human knowledge. Divers stumbled upon colossal statues lying silently on the seabed, their carved features still visible despite centuries submerged. Temples, sphinxes, and inscriptions appeared from the mud, revealing a sprawling cityscape now frozen in time beneath layers of sediment. Among the most striking finds were the remains of the Temple of Amun, once a place where pharaohs legitimized their rule. Massive stone blocks, inscriptions in both Greek and Egyptian, and offerings left behind for the gods gave archaeologists a vivid glimpse of a society that believed their city was protected by divine favor, even as the earth beneath them betrayed them. Gold coins, ceremonial objects, and everyday tools revealed the rhythm of ordinary lives that ended abruptly when the waters rose and the ground fell. Today, Thonis Heracleion stands as one of the greatest examples of how fragile human achievement can be when confronted by the hidden forces of nature. A city that seemed eternal was erased in a single catastrophic event, leaving behind no survivors to tell its story. Only now, through the work of divers and archaeologists, has its voice returned, carried through the silent statues and submerged temples that remind us of what was lost. To imagine its streets filled again with merchants and pilgrims is to understand how quickly the world can shift and how entire civilizations can vanish beneath the sea without warning. Ani, the city of 1,000 churches. On the windswept borderlands between present-day Turkey and Armenia stand the broken walls of Ani, a city once celebrated as the city of 1,000 churches. At its height in the 10th and 11th centuries, Ani rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad in both population and splendor, drawing merchants and pilgrims to its fortified gates. Its position along key trade routes made it a crossroads for silk, spices, and ideas, and within its walls rose palaces, monasteries, and soaring cathedrals built from stone, carved in intricate patterns. The begratted Armenian kings chose Ani as their capital in the year 961, transforming it into a showcase of power and devotion. The Cathedral of Ani, designed by the renowned architect Pripyat, dominated the city with a scale and elegance that influenced later Armenian architecture for generations. Smaller chapels and churches filled the districts, each adorned with carvings that blended religious symbolism with depictions of daily life. To outsiders, it was astonishing that so many churches could rise within one city, giving Ani a spiritual reputation that matched its economic and political importance. The city became not only a hub for commerce, but a beacon of faith, where processions and festivals filled the calendar and the bells of countless towers echoed over the surrounding plain. Yet Ani's prosperity also made it a target. Waves of conflict swept across the region, and armies fought to claim or destroy what the Bagratids had built. In the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire took control, followed soon after by the Seljuk Turks. Each new ruler left scars on the city, whether through neglect, conquest, or looting. But the growing instability weakened the once mighty city, and its resilience was tested again and again as invasions and natural disasters compounded its decline. One of the most devastating blows came from within the earth itself. In 1319, a powerful earthquake struck Ani, toppling many of its great buildings and leaving others cracked and weakened. The once majestic cathedral partially collapsed, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Survivors fled, and though some later returned, Ani never fully recovered from the destruction. Without the wealth and manpower to rebuild, the city's role as a regional power faded, and its churches, once crowded with worshippers, stood increasingly empty. The Silk Road, which had sustained Ani with a constant flow of merchants, also shifted over time. Trade routes moved, bypassing the ruined city and further draining it of purpose. Where caravans had once brought treasures from distant lands, silence settled, broken only by the wind that swept across the plateau. Ani, once described as impregnable, became abandoned, its walls no longer defended, and its gates closed not by force, but by neglect. Long after its fall, Ani's remains continue to evoke both admiration and discomfort. The remains of the cathedral rise starkly against the horizon, its arches open to the sky, while half-buried chapels scatter the grasslands like fragments of memory. The church of St. Gregory, with its detailed frescoes still faintly visible on the crumbling walls, hints at the artistry that once flourished there. Visitors who walk among the stones can still trace the outlines of avenues and markets, imagining the throngs that once filled them. Yet the overwhelming impression is one of loss, as if the city's silence holds the echoes of prayers and voices that will never return. Modern explorers and historians often refer to Ani as a ghost city, and standing among its ruins, it is easy to understand why. The empty windows of its churches resemble watchful eyes, and the remnants of its fortification appear less like defences than monuments to a vanished age. For Armenians, Ani carries a powerful emotional weight, representing both cultural achievement and the pain of displacement. For others, it is a reminder of how even the most thriving civilizations can vanish within the span of a few generations, undone by war, natural disaster, and shifting tides of history. At present, Ani sits on the edge of a closed border, watched over by a few, but remembered by many. Grass grows over stones where priests once walked, and the foundations of houses lie scattered like forgotten footprints. Yet even in ruin, Ani commands reverence. The sight of a once thriving city, reduced to silence, forces those who see it to imagine what it was like when its churches stood whole and its streets filled with life. In that contrast between past grandeur and present desolation lies the haunting power of Ani, a city of 1,000 churches that became a city of echoes. Mohenjo-Daro's sudden end. The remains of Mohenjo-Daro sit along the banks of the Indus River in present-day Pakistan, a city whose baked brick walls and carefully aligned streets once echoed with the footsteps of tens of thousands of people. When archaeologists began uncovering it in the 1920s, they were stunned not just by the scale of the settlement, but by how advanced its planning was compared to other Bronze Age societies. Straight roads divided the city into precise blocks, houses were equipped with wells and bathing areas, and a drainage system carried wastewater beneath the streets in a manner that seemed strikingly modern. The Great Bath, a large public pool lined with brick and sealed with bitumen, suggested that rituals connected to water may have been at the centre of civic life. Everything about Mohenjo-Daro hinted at a thriving, organised community where urban order and daily routine were carefully managed. Yet, for all its brilliance, the city did not last. Around 1900 BCE, evidence suggests that Mohenjo-Daro began to empty, and within a short span, the heart of the settlement had gone quiet. Archaeologists piecing together its decline face a puzzle without a single solution. Climate records point to a weakening of the monsoon system, which would have reduced crop yields and made the fertile Indus plain increasingly fragile. Canals that once carried river water into the fields began to silt up, and without reliable harvests, sustaining such a large population became nearly impossible. Excavators also found human remains lying in odd positions across streets and homes, some with injuries that appear violent, fueling speculation about conflict or sudden disaster. Early scholars suggested an invasion by outside groups, possibly Indo-Aryans moving into the region, though later studies questioned whether such a theory matched the physical evidence. The bodies did not appear to be mass graves of battle casualties, but rather scattered individuals, raising the possibility that disease, famine, or social collapse was responsible. Still, the image of a city that once thrived with order and prosperity only to leave behind skeletons abandoned in its streets, has remained deeply unsettling. The river itself may have betrayed Mohenjo-Daro. Shifts in the Indus and its tributaries could have altered the city's water supply, either flooding it with destructive force or depriving it of vital access. Sediment layers indicate episodes of flooding, with water rising high enough to leave thick deposits inside buildings. For people who had depended on the balance of river and monsoon, such repeated shocks could have made the city unlivable, forcing residents to scatter into smaller settlements away from the flood-prone plains. Adding to the mystery are traces of what appear to be burned walls and collapsed structures, leading some to argue that fire or sudden catastrophe struck parts of the settlement. But the absence of consistent signs across the site suggests that whatever happened, it was not a single cataclysm that reduced the city in one moment. Instead, Mohenjo-Daro seems to have unraveled through a mix of pressures: changing climate, faltering agriculture, possible disease, internal conflict, and unstable rivers, each weakening the city until it could no longer sustain itself. The tragedy of its decline feels sharper, knowing how advanced its design had been. The city's water systems, its orderly grid, and its public architecture all speak to people who understood how to manage life in a complex urban centre. Yet those achievements could not shield them from the forces of nature and history that eventually forced abandonment. Unlike later empires that left behind records of conquest and downfall, Mohenjo-Daro left no written account of its own ending. The script used by the Indus Valley civilization has never been deciphered, leaving silence where explanations might have been. Across the crumbling site, modern visitors walk the sun-scorched ruins before climbing the stupa mound that rises above broken roads and dwellings. The silence of the site contrasts sharply with the bustle it once held, and the unanswered questions about its fate linger in every broken wall. Was it hunger that drove the people away, or waves of flooding that buried their homes, or some unseen sickness that emptied their streets? The fragments of pottery, the carefully laid bricks, and the scattered skeletons offer pieces of a story that still refuses to come together completely. Mohenjo-Daro stands as a reminder that even the most sophisticated cities can collapse without warning. Its end was not written in a single moment of conquest or destruction, but in a slow and uncertain decline that left behind more questions than answers. For all that archaeologists have uncovered, the final days of this once thriving city remain one of history's most enduring mysteries. Hattusa's silent abandonment. High on the Anatolian plateau, where the land is carved by cliffs and rolling hills, the ruins of Hattusa lie in silence, their stone walls tracing the outline of a city that once commanded an empire. This was the capital of the Hittites, a people who rivaled the Egyptians and Babylonians, negotiating treaties, leading armies, and ruling over vast lands with authority and precision. For centuries, the city was alive with processions through monumental gates, its temples filled with offerings to gods carved in stone, and its archives holding thousands of clay tablets that recorded alliances, laws, and prayers. Yet by the close of the Bronze Age, the city that had stood at the center of power was abandoned, its great halls left to crumble, and its people scattered, leaving behind more questions than answers. Walking among the remnants today, one can still trace the massive walls that once stretched for miles, punctuated by towers and gates shaped like lions and sphinxes. These gates were not just entrances, but symbols of power, meant to impress those who approached and remind them of the might of the Hittite king. Within those walls stood royal residences, storage rooms filled once with grain, and open courtyards where ceremonies unfolded before the eyes of priests and citizens. Hattusa was built with an order that suggested not only strength, but also a deep connection between religion and rule, where the divine was interwoven into every aspect of life. To abandon such a place would not have been a decision taken lightly, and the reasons behind it remain wrapped in mystery. Archaeologists piecing together the story have uncovered signs that point to pressure from many directions. The city lies in a region that often faces drought, and evidence of shrinking harvests suggests that food supplies may have become too thin to sustain the population. A society so dependent on agriculture would have struggled if the fields failed year after year, and the once wealthy capital might have found itself weakened from within. At the same time, records from other lands mention unrest and the movements of hostile groups, often referred to as the Sea Peoples, who swept across the eastern Mediterranean around the same time. Whether they directly reached Hattusa or not, the disruption of trade routes and the collapse of neighbouring powers would have left the Hittites vulnerable, isolated, and unable to maintain their strength. Still, the fall of Hattusa does not appear to have been sudden in the way of a city conquered overnight. Excavations show that buildings were burned in some places, but the destruction was not uniform, and it suggests a gradual decline rather than a single cataclysm. Some of the archives were deliberately emptied, as if officials took what they could before departing, leaving behind only fragments of once immense collection. It paints the picture of a city slowly unravelling, with its leaders perhaps recognizing that they could no longer hold their ground and choosing retreat over ruin. By the early 12th century BCE, the capital of an empire had become a deserted shell, its silence broken only by the winds across the plateau. The fate of the Hittite people after the loss of Hattusa remains partly in shadow, though traces of their culture continued to appear in smaller states to the south and east. They did not vanish entirely, but the unified power that once negotiated with pharaohs and threatened kingdoms was gone. The disappearance of the capital left a gap in the history of the ancient Near East, one that scholars have tried to fill with surviving texts and scattered ruins. Among the most striking discoveries are the stone reliefs carved with lines of gods, figures marching in procession across a sanctuary wall, preserved as if waiting for their worshippers to return. These images, alongside the broken tablets and the silent gates, are what remain of a civilization that once believed its foundations to be unshakable. It's the quietness of Hattusa's final days that makes them so disturbing. Unlike cities destroyed by armies in a blaze of violence, this capital seems to have slipped into abandonment, leaving behind the impression of a people who simply could not resist the weight of too many forces pressing against them at once. The walls still stand in places, massive blocks of stone defying the centuries, but inside them there are no voices, no movement, no signs of the thousands who once lived and worked there. The silence of Hattusa is heavy, for it is the silence of a civilization that fell not with a roar but with a fading breath, leaving its story scattered across stones and clay for others to piece together. Ur's abrupt fall. Beneath the dry plains of southern Mesopotamia lie the ruins of Ur, a city that once glimmered with ziggurats, palaces, and streets alive with traders from every corner of the ancient world. Known as one of the great Sumerian city-states, Ur rose in wealth and prestige through its control of trade along the Persian Gulf, drawing caravans of merchants who carried copper, lapis lazuli, and grain. Its great ziggurat towered above the flat landscape, a massive stair-stepped monument that could be seen from miles away, signalling not only the city's devotion to the gods, but also its ability to marshal the labour and resources of a thriving urban society. Yet, for all its power, Ur's story did not end in triumph, but in a sudden unravelling that left its once proud streets silent and broken. Archaeological excavations have revealed a city of extraordinary complexity, with carefully laid out neighbourhoods, central temples, and evidence of advanced administration, but also layers of destruction that speak to violence and collapse. The archives discovered in its ruins tell of dynasties that ruled with ambition and of armies that marched across Mesopotamia to defend Ur's dominance, yet they also speak of enemies gathering strength at the city's borders. Around the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE, the Elamites pressed in from the east while Amorite tribes advanced from the west, both seeking to carve out their own place in the rich lands of Mesopotamia. For Ur, hemmed in on multiple sides, the pressure was relentless. The signs of decline were not immediate, but crept slowly into the city's life. Letters from officials describe shortages of grain, difficulties in supplying the temples, and growing unrest among the population. Trade routes that once brought wealth became more dangerous to travel, and rival powers disrupted the flow of goods. The king at the time, Ibisin, struggled to hold together what remained of his domain, sending out pleas for aid that went unanswered. As enemies closed in, the walls of could not keep the turmoil at bay, and the final blow came with brutal force. When the Elamites eventually stormed the city, the destruction was thorough and devastating. Excavators uncovered evidence of burning and smashed buildings, with layers of ash covering streets where once merchants and priests had walked. The royal tombs, filled with treasures in earlier centuries, now lay desecrated, their contents scattered or stolen. Records suggest that Ibisin himself was captured and carried off into captivity, the once great ruler reduced to a prisoner in the hands of his conquerors. For the citizens of the sudden violence meant not only death and enslavement, but the shattering of the entire way of life they had known. The striking thing about Ur's collapse is how swiftly it came and how quietly it ended. Unlike other cities that managed to recover after invasions, never regained its former prominence. The canals that fed its fields fell into disrepair, salt crept into the soil, and the once fertile land grew barren. Without water and harvests, the population dwindled, and the monumental ziggurat that had once symbolized divine favor began to crumble under the desert winds. The city's power had been extinguished, and its ruins became a place of memory rather than of life. Modern archaeologists piecing together Ur's end find themselves struck by how sudden the transition feels. From bustling urban power to conquered ruin, the shift happened within a generation, leaving no long era of gradual fading, but rather a clear moment when the city's heart stopped beating. Standing among the remains today, it is possible to trace the outlines of streets, to walk through the foundations of houses, and to climb the reconstructed steps of the ziggurat. Yet the life that once filled these spaces cannot be imagined without also recalling how quickly it was torn away. Ur's abrupt fall reminds us how fragile even the greatest of cities can be when caught between the forces of invasion, environmental strain, and political weakness. What seemed eternal to its citizens, their temples, their palaces, their role at the center of Mesopotamian civilization, was brought to an end with startling swiftness. All that remains now are broken bricks and the memories etched into clay tablets, testifying to a city that once thrived and then, almost without warning, was lost to history. Tikal, the deserted temples. In the deep jungles of Guatemala rise the remnants of Tikal, a once thriving city whose towering temples now stand as silent markers of a vanished world. Centuries ago, its plazas, filled with priests, rulers, and merchants, the sound of drums and conch shells echoing across stone courtyards as ceremonies unfolded beneath massive pyramids carved with scenes of gods and king. By the height of the 8th century, Tikal was among the most powerful of the Maya cities, its influence stretching far across the lowlands, supported by trade in obsidian, jade, and cacao, and sustained by a vast population that may have numbered in the tens of thousands. Its rise had been steady, marked by wars with rival cities like Calakmul, yet even as it grew, the seeds of its decline were already being sown in the land that supported it. The forest around Tikal was not just wilderness, it was the source of life for the city. Farmers carved terraces, dug reservoirs, and cultivated maize in carefully managed fields that seemed endless when viewed from the tops of the temples. For centuries, the system worked, feeding the population and allowing rulers to sponsor grand constructions and elaborate rituals. But as the centuries wore on, the balance began to falter. Trees were cut down to make room for crops and to provide wood for building and fuel, leaving the soil exposed and fragile. Each successive generation drew more from the land, and the thin soils of the lowlands could not recover as quickly as they were used. Signs of this stress began to show in the 9th century, when evidence suggests periods of severe drought struck the region, and the reservoirs that once glistened with water may have run dry. Life within the city must have shifted under the weight of these changes. People would have gathered in the plazas hoping for rain, as rulers and priests promised divine intervention, carrying out rituals meant to appease the gods of water and fertility. When the rains failed, trust in the ruling dynasty may have weakened, especially in a culture where the king was seen as a mediator between the people and the gods. Archaeologists have uncovered signs of growing conflict in these final years, fortifications hastily built, evidence of warfare, and scattered remains suggesting violence played a role in the unraveling. Rival city-states, also struggling with the same environmental and social pressures, may have turned on one another, and the alliances that once supported Tikal could no longer hold. Walking through the ruins today, it is striking to imagine the slow withdrawal of people from this monumental city. Temples like Temple 1 and Temple 4, which once loomed over the canopy with their steep staircases, would have seen fewer offerings left at their bases, fewer ceremonies to honor the dead rulers buried within. The ball courts, once the setting of games tied deeply to religion and politics, would have grown quiet, their stone walls echoing only with the calls of birds. Families may have left gradually, seeking more reliable water sources in smaller settlements, or moving toward regions less vulnerable to drought. By the end of the 9th century, the great plazas were largely deserted, the once powerful heart of the city reduced to scattered groups struggling to survive. The mystery of Tikal's desertion is not tied to a single event, but to a chain of stresses that built upon one another. Droughts weakened agriculture, deforestation worsened the impact, political rivalries turned violent, and the belief in divine rulers crumbled under the weight of unmet promises. Unlike a city destroyed by fire or conquest in a single moment, Tikal slipped into silence gradually, its decline unfolding over decades, leaving archaeologists with layers of evidence rather than a single dramatic end. With the jungle wrapped in mist and the sounds of howler monkeys carrying across the forest, the ancient stones of Tikal seem to belong to both past and present at once. The massive temples rise above the canopy like stone mountains, reminders of a civilization that mastered architecture, astronomy, and agriculture, only to see its foundation collapse under the strain of its own growth and the whims of nature. The deserted temples speak not just of grandeur, but of fragility, a warning etched in stone that even the mightiest cities can vanish when the balance between people, power, and environment is broken. Teotihuacan, the burned city of the gods, the wide avenue that later visitors would call the Avenue of the Dead, once stretched for miles, lined with temples, pyramids, and palaces that gleamed in the light of the sun. Teotihuacan was already centuries old by the time it reached its greatest power, a place where tens of thousands gathered for markets, ceremonies, and daily life. The pyramids of the sun and the moon rose above everything else, their massive stone stairways leading to platforms where priests watched the horizon and offered rituals to the gods. It was a city of careful design, its streets laid out in a strict grid, its walls painted with vivid murals showing jaguars, serpents, and figures wearing elaborate headdresses. For generations, it seemed unshakable, a true city of the gods. And yet, when archaeologists walked those same avenues more than 1,000 years later, what they found told a different story. Many of the temples had been set on fire, their walls blackened by smoke, their sacred chambers reduced to rubble. Palaces showed signs of deliberate destruction, sculptures smashed into fragments, symbols chiseled away. The great city had not merely declined and faded like others, before it had been torn apart from within. There are clues scattered across the ruins. In the northern district, once the home of priests and elites, layers of ash lie thick in the soil, suggesting coordinated fires that burned across multiple structures at once. Rooms that once held offerings of obsidian, jade, and shells were left scattered, the treasures looted or discarded in haste. The murals that survived showed deep scratches, as though someone had taken time to erase what they represented. Even the Pyramid of the Sun, towering and immense, was not spared. Evidence of burning around its base suggests that it too was desecrated during the city's unraveling. The eerie part of Teotihuacan's destruction lies in the fact that no foreign army caused it. There is no trace of an outside army sweeping in to sack the city. Instead, it appears the violence came from its own people, perhaps the lower classes turning against their rulers. For centuries, the priests and elites had commanded labor on a staggering scale, building monuments larger than any in the Americas of that time. The wealth of the city flowed into ceremonial centers, while those who worked the fields and produced food may have lived under increasing strain. Droughts recorded in the surrounding valleys suggest harvests were failing. The combination of hunger, inequality, and anger may have reached a breaking point, and the city's heart was set ablaze from within. After the flames died, Teotihuacan was never the same. The once bustling avenues grew quiet, and its population, once estimated at well over 100, began to scatter. Some families may have stayed among the ruins, living in the shadow of the burned temples, but the city as a unified power was gone. Its rulers, whoever they had been, lost all authority, and the great urban experiment ended in silence. When the Aztecs finally came upon the ruins, the enormity of the structures left them awestruck, leading them to believe that gods, not humans, had built them. They gave it the name Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were born. By then, no memory remained of who had lived there, what language they spoke, or what names they had given to their monuments. Only the scorched stones remained, a city once vibrant and alive, now a husk haunted by fire. At the foot of the Pyramid of the Sun, it is easy to imagine smoke drifting skyward, the crash of walls under fire, and the confusion of people caught in their own uprising. The people who set those fires may have thought they were bringing down the old order, freeing themselves from rulers who had lost touch with reality. Instead, they ended their own city, leaving behind ruins that would puzzle the world for centuries to come. Teotihuacan's story is unsettling because it shows how fragile even the most powerful places can be. For generations, it stood as the greatest city in the Americas, filled with order, wealth, and the symbols of divine rule. And yet, in what seems to have been a brief moment of fury, it was undone not by enemies from afar, but by the very people who once built it. Atlantis, memory of a single night. Over 2,000 years have passed, yet the tale of Atlantis, first told by Plato, still sparks curiosity in the imagination of humanity. According to the philosopher, it was a vast island kingdom, far larger than Libya and Asia combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Its cities gleamed with gold and marble, canals wound between grand palaces, and temples rose to honor gods whose favor shaped every aspect of daily life. The Atlanteans were described as a people both powerful and advanced, commanding armies, building fleets, and harnessing knowledge of architecture and engineering that rivaled any known civilization. For readers of Plato's accounts, the tale suggests a society of remarkable order, where wealth and technology flourished alongside rituals and civic structures. All its glory could not save Atlantis, which vanished in one night. The account tells of earthquakes and floods, forces so sudden and overwhelming that the entire island sank beneath the waves. The story leaves the details intentionally vague, but the imagery is stark: temples swallowed by water, streets vanishing beneath the ocean, and a people who had once walked in power reduced to memory. It is this abruptness, more than the island's scale or wealth, that has fascinated scholars and storytellers alike. The collapse of Atlantis is not described as a slow decay, but as an immediate judgment, leaving no time for preparation or evacuation. Plato's dialogues suggest that the fall was as much moral as it was physical. He describes the Atlanteans as once virtuous, but eventually proud and overreaching, their ambitions stretching beyond what the gods had allowed. While the details may be philosophical allegory rather than historical record, the story conveys the idea that even a society at the height of its power can vanish overnight if it loses balance with the forces that sustain it. Whether taken literally or symbolically, Atlantis serves as a haunting example of abrupt disappearance, a civilization wiped clean from the surface of the earth before later generations could grasp its full existence. For hundreds of years, theories about Atlantis have spanned the globe, pointing to places as varied as the Mediterranean, Caribbean, Azores, and Antarctica. Each proposed site offers fragments of possibility: submerged landmasses, unusual geological formations, or traces of ancient settlements that might align with Plato's narrative. Yet no definitive evidence has ever confirmed the existence of a literal Atlantis. This absence only adds to its eerie power. Unlike Pompeii or Mohenjo-Daro, where ruins allow us to trace daily life and social structure, Atlantis exists primarily in the mind, reconstructed from imagination, allegory, and hope. Its sudden disappearance leaves only a void, forcing us to imagine what once was. The idea of a civilization lost in one night resonates beyond the literal story. It reflects a universal fear that even the most organized, wealthy, and technologically advanced society can be undone in a moment, whether by natural disaster, human error, or forces beyond comprehension. Writers and philosophers have returned to Atlantis for centuries because it captures the tension between achievement and vulnerability, a civilization that achieved greatness, yet was undone before anyone could learn its full story. In the modern world, the ruins of submerged islands, sunken cities, and vanished cultures often serve as stand-ins for Atlantis, offering glimpses of human history abruptly interrupted. Yet none match the totality described in Plato, the complete erasure of a civilization from land and memory. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, embodies the idea that a single night can erase not only people and buildings, but entire systems of knowledge, governance, and culture. That idea continues to haunt historians, storytellers, and explorers, because it challenges the assumption that great civilizations endure simply by virtue of their size, wealth, or power. Standing metaphorically at the edge of the Atlantic or Mediterranean, one can almost hear the imagined roar of water-consuming streets, the cracking of temples, and the cries of a population caught unprepared. The very immediacy of the loss, the abrupt transition from a thriving society to emptiness, makes Atlantis one of the most compelling stories of sudden collapse ever recorded. Unlike cities that decline slowly or are destroyed by invasion, Atlantis was gone before it could leave behind monuments or survivors. Atlantis remains a memory of a single night, a civilization preserved only in story, warning, and imagination. Its disappearance is absolute, untraceable, and unrelenting. It reminds us that even the greatest achievements can vanish in an instant, leaving only whispers in philosophy, echoes in literature, and the enduring question of what it was like to walk through streets and temples that now exist only in memory. In that haunting absence, Atlantis endures an impossible city, vanished yet unforgettable. Palenque, the vanishing lords. Hidden for centuries beneath dense foliage, the ruins of Palenque rise like stone sentinels in the lush jungles of Chiapas, Mexico. Once a thriving city of the Maya, Palenque was renowned for its intricate architecture, elaborate tombs, and the influence of its ruling dynasty. The city's temples and palaces, adorned with carvings of gods, kings, and mythological scenes, told stories of conquest, alliances, and ceremonies that shaped daily life. By the 7th century, Palenque had reached its peak, ruled by kings like Pakal the Great, whose tomb within the Temple of the Inscriptions remains one of the most remarkable discoveries of the ancient Americas. Streets and plazas bustled with artisans, merchants, and priests, their lives governed by ritual, trade, and the rhythms of the surrounding jungle. The end of Palenque arrived swiftly, in spite of its power. Archaeologists studying the site have found evidence suggesting that within a few decades, the city was largely abandoned. Unlike cities overtaken by foreign invaders, Palenque appears to have been left by its own people, its ruling elite disappearing along with the broader population. Scholars have debated the causes, pointing to a combination of environmental stress, warfare with rival Maya city-states, and internal political strife. Deforestation for construction and agriculture may have led to soil erosion, while prolonged periods of drought made water storage and crop production increasingly difficult. These pressures created conditions that challenged both the city's leaders and its citizens, weakening their capacity to maintain urban life. There is a haunting quality to Palenque's history, marked by the sudden disappearance of its rulers. The inscriptions on its temples provide detailed accounts of dynastic history, recording the deeds of kings, their battles, marriages, and religious duties. Yet, after the late 8th century, these records abruptly stop. Tombs of later rulers remain unfinished or empty, and many palaces were left to fall into ruin. It is as if the leadership, once so carefully chronicled, simply vanished, leaving the city without guidance. Without the support and authority of the elite, the population that depended on their rule for trade, religious ceremony, and infrastructure may have had little choice but to leave. Archaeological evidence hints at the hurried nature of the departure. In some structures, belongings were left behind, pottery and tools scattered across floors, suggesting residents abandoned them in haste. In other areas, walls show signs of collapse, possibly from neglect or small-scale destruction. Unlike the deliberate burning seen in some ancient cities, Palenque's decay appears gradual, yet the overall effect is striking. A major city emptied of its population and power, leaving temples and plazas to be reclaimed by the jungle. Even in the midst of abandonment, Palenque's construction reflects the sophistication of its society. Its canals and aqueducts managed water through the rainy and dry seasons, while terraces and agricultural plots supported a large population. The Temple of the Inscriptions, with its carefully planned burial chamber for Pakal, demonstrates a mastery of engineering, astronomy, and art. These achievements persisted long after the city was vacated, preserved in stone, and hidden in the overgrowth, a testament to the capabilities of its vanished rulers. The vanishing of Palenque's elite also shaped the culture of the surrounding region. Refugees and displaced families may have carried knowledge, artistic styles, and religious practices to nearby cities, influencing the broader Maya world even as their original city fell silent. Artifacts from Palenque have been found in distant locations, suggesting trade and cultural exchange continued even after the city's core was abandoned. In this way, the influence of the vanished lords extended beyond the boundaries of their own vanished city, leaving a subtle but lasting legacy. Amid Palenque's soaring temples and crumbling palaces, silence is almost absolute, disturbed only by the soft rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. The temples rise above the canopy, reminders of a civilization that reached great heights yet disappeared with astonishing speed. The story of the city is preserved in stone, carvings, and inscriptions, but the people themselves are gone, their lives, rituals, and governance leaving only traces for archaeologists and historians to reconstruct. Palenque remains a powerful example of sudden disappearance. Its rulers and citizens did not vanish in a single night, but within a few decades, the city that had been a center of culture, religion, and politics was largely emptied, leaving the jungle to reclaim what humans had built. The vanished lords of Palenque are a haunting reminder of how fragile even the most advanced and thriving civilizations can be when faced with environmental strain, political instability, and societal pressure. Their legacy endures only in memory, artifacts, and the silent temples that continue to rise above the forest. Mesa Verde, empty cliffs. High on the cliffs of what is now southwestern Colorado, the stone dwellings of Mesa Verde cling to ledges and overhangs, silent reminders of a civilization that once thrived in the high desert. The ancestral Puebloans built these cliff homes between the 12th and 13th centuries, carving rooms and towers from sandstone and fitting them together with remarkable precision. Kivas, ceremonial chambers sunken into the ground, reveal the spiritual life of the community, while granaries and storage rooms suggest careful planning and an intimate knowledge of the environment. For generations, families lived, worked, and worshipped here, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the seasons, the flow of nearby rivers, and the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash on the mesas above. Even with the impressive architectural achievements at Mesa Verde, its people were not immune to the circumstances that forced them to leave. Archaeologists have studied evidence of environmental stress, including prolonged droughts, soil depletion, and deforestation, which made farming increasingly difficult. As food became scarce and water sources less reliable, tensions within the community may have grown, and the ability to sustain such a dense population on the cliffs became more precarious. The construction of cliff dwellings had once offered protection from the elements and potential raiders, but it could not shield the people from the slow, invisible pressures of the land itself. Life in the cliff homes demanded adaptation and cooperation. Narrow passageways connected clusters of rooms, and ladders provided access to upper levels and terraces. Smoke from hearths rose through carefully designed ventilation systems, and pottery indicates that families cooked, stored, and traded food with skill and organization. Yet beneath the orderly appearance of daily life, challenges were mounting. Burials within the community suggest that mortality increased during times of stress, and some kivas show signs of disuse, hinting at the gradual reduction of social and religious activity. By the late 13th century, the population began to abandon the cliff dwellings, moving to lower lands or joining other communities in the surrounding region. The process was not sudden in the sense of a violent attack, but it was decisive. Homes that had taken decades to build were left behind, often containing tools, pottery, and personal belongings. The meticulous storage of food and supplies in some abandoned rooms suggests that departures may have been carefully planned, at least in part, even if driven by necessity. Families likely carried what they could, moving slowly through the rugged terrain, leaving the cliffs empty, except for the occasional caretaker or returning hunter. The suddenness of the departure is evident in the layers of artifacts and soil. Rooms show little evidence of repair or renovation in the final years, implying that maintenance ceased as the population shrank. Fire was not the cause of abandonment, as many structures remain intact, yet the absence of human activity allowed the elements to slowly reclaim the dwellings. Roofs collapsed, walls weathered, and trees and shrubs grew in places once cleared for terraces and gardens. Within a generation, the cliff homes transformed from bustling centers of life to silent monuments, a civilization preserved in stone and memory rather than in ongoing habitation. The emptiness that pervades Mesa Verde stands as proof of human achievement and its delicate nature. The ancestral Puebloans achieved extraordinary feats of engineering, adapted to a challenging environment, and created a complex society that balanced ritual, agriculture, and trade. Yet even these accomplishments could not prevent the city's decline once environmental and social pressures became too great. The cliffs, once crowded with activity, now offer only echoes of life, the wind carrying the faint memory of voices, footsteps, and the rhythms of daily tasks long vanished. As they wander among Mesa Verde's stone dwellings, visitors today can follow the contours of rooms, ascend the rock-carved steps, and imagine the people who once lived there. The abandoned granaries, ceremonial kivas, and residential towers tell a story of resilience and adaptation, but also of sudden departure and the fragile nature of human settlements. The empty cliffs remain a powerful symbol of a people who mastered their environment, only to face circumstances that left them with no choice but to move on. Mesa Verde reminds us that civilizations, no matter how skillful or resourceful, can disappear from a landscape swiftly when the balance of survival shifts. Its story is preserved in stone, in the remnants of daily life, and in the quiet emptiness that now dominates the cliffs, offering a glimpse into a society that once thrived and then vanished, leaving only memory and the enduring impression of human ingenuity against a challenging world. Great Zimbabwe's sudden silence. Rising from the hills of modern Zimbabwe, the massive stone circles and terraces of Great Zimbabwe stand in quiet grandeur, recalling a kingdom that once held sway over trade and culture in southern Africa. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, the city was a center of wealth, drawing ivory, gold, and exotic goods from the interior to the coast for trade with distant lands. The great enclosures, particularly the hill complex, were more than architectural feats. They symbolized political authority, spiritual life, and social organization. Within these walls, kings ruled, artisans worked, and citizens moved through streets lined with carefully fitted granite blocks, carrying out the daily routine of a sophisticated urban centre. Though awe-inspiring, Great Zimbabwe did not endure through the centuries. By the late 15th century, the city appears to have been largely abandoned. Archaeologists have debated the causes, suggesting a combination of environmental stress, overgrazing, and depletion of local resources. The growing population had placed increasing demand on the land, and the surrounding terrain could no longer sustain large herds or extensive agriculture. Water sources may have become unreliable during periods of drought, and soils were likely exhausted by centuries of cultivation. These pressures created conditions that undermined the city's capacity to feed and support its population, forcing many to leave in search of more hospitable areas. The suddenness of Great Zimbabwe's abandonment is apparent in the archaeological record. Unlike cities destroyed by invaders or fire, the stone walls and enclosures were left largely intact, but household items, pottery, and tools were often scattered or left behind. Some granaries and dwellings show little evidence of prolonged use in the final years, suggesting that departure was swift and widespread. Families may have moved together, leaving behind the monuments and symbols of their authority. The careful construction of the city's walls and towers, once the pride of its rulers, could not prevent the quiet exodus of its people. Political and social factors likely compounded environmental difficulties. Great Zimbabwe had been a hub of regional authority, and its rulers depended on loyalty and tribute from surrounding communities. As resources dwindled, maintaining control over both the population within the city and the network of smaller settlements that supported it would have become increasingly difficult. Internal conflict or competition for scarce resources may have prompted segments of the population to leave earlier than others, accelerating the city's decline. The sudden silence of Great Zimbabwe reflects not a single moment of disaster, but a convergence of pressures that culminated in the rapid withdrawal of its people. Findings from nearby regions indicate that Great Zimbabwe's influence persisted long after the city was abandoned. Settlers and traders may have carried cultural practices, architectural knowledge, and religious traditions to new locations, ensuring that the influence of the city endured in ways that stone walls alone could not convey. Objects such as beads, pottery, and tools show continuity in style and craftsmanship, indicating that communities preserved knowledge and skills even as they dispersed. In this sense, Great Zimbabwe did not vanish entirely. Its memory and achievements persisted among the people who once called it home. Strolling among the ruins, one cannot help but feel both awe and unease at the city's vast scale. Massive walls rise above the hills, tracing curves and circles that once defined plazas, residences, and ceremonial spaces. Towers and enclosures stand as monuments to human ingenuity, yet the absence of inhabitants transforms them into silent witnesses of a sudden departure. The city's stones, weathered by centuries, offer glimpses of life that thrived here: communal gatherings, trade negotiations, religious ceremonies, and the daily work of men, women, and children. Each block, each passageway, is a reminder that the bustling heart of Great Zimbabwe can vanish when the foundations of survival are undermined. The quiet disappearance of Great Zimbabwe stands as a powerful example of a civilization undone without dramatic upheaval. Its decline was not marked by fire or invasion, but by environmental pressures, social strain, and the gradual unraveling of urban life, culminating in a sudden silence that left the city empty. Yet in that silence, the ingenuity and legacy of its people endure, preserved in the structures they built, the artifacts they left behind, and the influence they carried to surrounding regions. Great Zimbabwe remains a testament to both human achievement and fragility, a city whose sudden disappearance continues to captivate and educate centuries later. Cahokia, the abandoned mounds. On the western bank of the Mississippi River, near modern-day St. Louis, the sprawling earthworks of Cahokia rise like giant, silent monuments to a civilization that once dominated the region. Between the 10th and 14th centuries, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico, home to tens of thousands of people. Massive earthen mounds, some reaching more than 100 feet high, marked plazas, ceremonial centers, and the residences of elites. Monk's Mound, the largest of them all, served as the centerpiece of the city, its terraces supporting structures where leaders would have conducted rituals and overseen governance. Streets were laid out with careful planning, and smaller mounds and plazas supported craft workshops, markets, and community gatherings. Life in Cahokia was bustling, its population thriving on agriculture, hunting, and trade along the river system that connected distant communities. While the city gave the impression of lasting strength, it eventually fell. By the mid-14th century, evidence suggests that Cahokia was largely abandoned, its streets emptied, and mounds left untended. Archaeologists have pointed to a combination of environmental stress, social tension, and resource depletion as contributing factors. The surrounding forests were cleared for agriculture and fuel, which may have led to soil exhaustion and increased vulnerability to erosion and flooding. Periods of drought, identified through tree ring analysis, would have strained water supplies and crop yields, making survival increasingly precarious. These pressures likely created conditions that eroded confidence in leadership and disrupted the city's complex social structures. Signs of rapid abandonment appear in the archaeological record. Residential areas show evidence of abrupt departure. Hearths were left cold, pottery and tools abandoned, and some structures partially dismantled. Unlike cities destroyed by fire or invasion, Cahokia's mounds were not intentionally destroyed, but the neglect is telling. Without maintenance, the wooden structures atop the mounds decayed, and over time, the carefully organized city fell into disrepair. Streets that once carried traders, artisans, and citizens became overgrown, and the plazas where ceremonies had been held went silent. The disappearance of the city's elite likely played a central role in Cahokia's decline. Leaders and religious figures commanded labor for construction, organized ceremonies, and regulated trade. As environmental and social pressures mounted, maintaining authority over a large population may have become impossible. Internal conflict, coupled with the demands of feeding and sustaining the population, may have prompted a decisive withdrawal. Families dependent on the stability and organization provided by the elites would have followed, leaving the city empty within a generation. The impact of Cahokia persisted across the region, long after its abandonment. Artifacts and cultural practices suggest that refugees carried knowledge of mound building, craftsmanship, and ceremonial traditions to nearby communities. Pottery styles, tool-making techniques, and religious symbols appear in other settlements, indicating that while the city itself was empty, its people and culture persisted elsewhere. This dispersal ensured that Cahokia's achievements were not entirely lost, even as its streets and plazas fell silent. Strolling through the surviving mounds, it's easy to imagine the vibrant life that once filled the city. Monk's Mound dominates the landscape, a reminder of the power and organization required to construct such a monument. Smaller mounds and plazas, now covered with grass and trees, hint at workshops, markets, and communal gatherings. The silence that now surrounds these structures is profound, the absence of human activity, transforming the city from a center of civilization to a ghostly testament of what once was. Cahokia's story is both extraordinary and haunting. It shows how a sophisticated, densely populated urban center can vanish when environmental and social systems are disrupted. Its decline was not sudden in the sense of destruction by enemies, yet within a relatively short span, the bustling city emptied, leaving only earthen monuments and scattered artifacts. The abandoned mounds are more than just physical remnants. They are symbols of human ingenuity, resilience, and the fragility of complex societies. In the quiet of the present, the city's empty mounds tell a story that endures across centuries. Cahokia, once a vibrant heart of trade, ceremony, and daily life, stands as a reminder that even the largest and most organized civilizations are vulnerable to the pressures of their environment and the limits of human management. Its disappearance challenges assumptions about permanence, leaving only memory, earth, and the silent mounds to speak for a city that vanished, but whose legacy continues to resonate. Çatalhöyük, the forgotten proto-city. On the flat plains of central Anatolia, the ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük rises not in towering walls or monumental structures, but in densely packed mud brick homes that stretch across the landscape, forming one of the earliest known proto-cities. Occupied between roughly 7,500 and 5,700 BCE, Çatalhöyük was remarkable for its size, organization, and the intricacy of its daily life. Houses were built directly adjacent to each other, with no streets, and residents moved across rooftops to enter homes. Inside, walls were adorned with murals depicting animals, hunting scenes, and abstract symbols, reflecting spiritual beliefs and cultural identity. Tools, pottery, and figurines reveal a society deeply engaged in agriculture, hunting, and craft production, as well as ritual practices that centered on both the household and the community. Its ingenuity notwithstanding, Çatalhöyük eventually came to an end. Archaeologists have found evidence that the settlement was gradually abandoned by the late 6th millennium BCE. The reasons are still debated, but environmental factors likely played a significant role. Changes in rainfall and the depletion of soil fertility may have made sustaining crops increasingly difficult. As food production became uncertain, the dense population may have faced increasing pressure to relocate to more fertile or safer areas. The layout of the city, which had once been an advantage for communal life and defense, may have also become a limitation when resources grew scarce. The nature of Çatalhöyük's abandonment suggests a community leaving in stages rather than a sudden destruction. Hearths and storage pits were emptied, and some houses show signs of being deliberately filled with debris before being left behind, perhaps as part of ritual closure. Personal belongings, tools, and pottery were often left within homes, indicating that many residents may have carried only essential items when moving. The absence of signs of warfare or fire suggests that the departure was largely driven by environmental and social pressures rather than violent conflict. Even as the community dispersed, the structures remained as a dense, silent imprint of a life once fully present. Social and cultural changes may have contributed to the departure. Çatalhöyük was unusual in its egalitarian organization, with no clear evidence of centralized rulers. Yet its residents maintained complex networks of trade, ritual, and craft specialization. As the challenges of sustaining the settlement intensified, these social systems may have struggled to adapt. Families may have gradually left for smaller, more manageable settlements, taking with them knowledge of agriculture, building techniques, and spiritual practices. Over time, the once bustling proto-city emptied, leaving behind the physical remnants of a culture that had flourished for more than a millennium. The legacy of Çatalhöyük persisted long after its abandonment. Artifacts from the site, including figurines and decorated pottery, reflect artistic traditions that influenced surrounding communities. Agricultural practices and techniques for building mud brick homes likely spread as displaced residents integrated into neighboring regions. The settlement's unique approach to communal living and rooftop mobility may have informed the development of later urban forms in Anatolia and beyond. While the city itself ceased to function, the knowledge, beliefs, and skills of its inhabitants continued to shape human communities for generations. The density of the settlement and its intimate layout become clear to anyone moving among the ruins today. The remnants of walls, hearths, and murals provide a vivid sense of daily life. Families preparing meals, artisans crafting pottery, and rituals performed for both the household and the wider community. The silence that now fills the site contrasts sharply with the energy that must have once animated it. Rooftops that were once thoroughfares for children and adults alike are empty, and narrow alleys between homes have been reclaimed by soil and vegetation. Yet the imprint of human life remains unmistakable, a testament to ingenuity, culture, and the challenges of sustaining a dense settlement in a changing environment. Çatalhöyük stands as a reminder that even early human settlements, innovative and well adapted to their surroundings, could face decline when environmental, social, or resource pressures became overwhelming. Its story is not one of dramatic destruction, but of quiet, staged abandonment, leaving a dense and silent cityscape as evidence of its former vitality. The site offers a rare glimpse into the resilience and fragility of early urban life, preserving the memory of a community that thrived, adapted, and ultimately moved on, leaving behind a testament to human ingenuity and the complexities of sustaining civilization in its earliest forms. Thule, the vanishing Arctic people. Far to the north, where the Arctic winds sweep across icy seas and tundra, the Thule people once thrived, leaving behind traces of a society uniquely adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Emerging around the 11th century, the Thule were skilled hunters and navigators, moving across vast expanses of ice and snow in search of whales, seals, and caribou. They built semi-subterranean houses lined with driftwood and stones to shelter from the relentless cold, and their toolkits included harpoons, sleds, and dog teams, demonstrating a deep understanding of both the land and the ocean. Settlements were often located near rich hunting grounds or along coastlines where ice and currents allowed access to marine resources, enabling a network of communities connected by both kinship and trade. Facing pressures beyond their control, even the adaptable Thule had to leave some areas behind. Archaeological evidence shows that by the 15th century, several northern settlements were vacated, leaving behind houses, tools, and hunting equipment. Environmental changes likely played a significant role. Shifts in sea ice patterns and local climate could have disrupted traditional hunting routes, making food sources less predictable and forcing families to relocate. The thinning of ice, increased storms, or changes in animal migration patterns may have made some areas no longer viable for sustained living. In some sites, the abruptness of abandonment is startling. Excavations reveal homes left intact, with hearths still in place and personal items scattered on floors, suggesting that residents departed quickly, perhaps following food sources or moving to more hospitable terrain. In other areas, evidence points to a staged withdrawal over a few generations, where families left in waves, leaving some structures temporarily occupied while others were deserted. Unlike cities destroyed by fire or conquest, the Thule settlements show no signs of violent disruption, highlighting a quiet yet decisive migration prompted by environmental and practical pressures rather than conflict. Social organization and survival skills would have influenced these movements. Thule communities depended on cooperation, shared hunting knowledge, and the careful management of resources. As the environment became more unpredictable, small decisions where to hunt, how to store food, and when to move carried life or death consequences. Leaders and skilled hunters likely guided families toward regions that promised greater security. Communities that could no longer sustain themselves in traditional territories gradually dispersed, moving along coastlines, rivers, and ice flows to areas where resources were more reliable. Artifacts left behind provide a glimpse into daily life and the challenges of abandonment. Tools, bone needles, and harpoon heads are scattered in homes, suggesting that people carried only what was essential when relocating. Cooking areas, with remnants of seal blubber or fish, reveal the diet that once sustained them, while dog sled parts and sled runners indicate the mobility that allowed families to traverse vast and dangerous landscapes. Even in empty settlements, these items speak to the ingenuity, resilience, and careful planning that defined Thule life. The departure of the Thule from certain regions did not erase their cultural impact. As communities moved, they spread knowledge, technology, and practices to new areas. Later, Inuit populations inherited and adapted many of these skills, including hunting techniques, tool-making, and architectural methods. In this way, the Thule legacy persisted, not in the empty houses left behind, but in the continuity of survival strategies and cultural practices across the Arctic. Visiting the remains of a Thule settlement today, the silence is palpable. Semi-subterranean homes, partially buried under snow and soil, stand as stark reminders of life once lived here. The surrounding landscape, harsh and unforgiving, stretches in every direction, emphasizing both the ingenuity required to thrive and the vulnerability of humans in extreme environments. The frozen ground preserves evidence of their daily existence, but it also serves as a testament to how quickly life can shift when conditions change. Adaptation, survival, and eventual migration define the story of the Thule in the face of unstoppable forces. Entire settlements were emptied, not through war or disaster, but through calculated decisions to seek survival elsewhere. Their sudden disappearance from certain regions demonstrates how even a skilled and resilient people can be forced to abandon homes when the balance between human activity and the environment tips too far. Yet in leaving, they ensured the survival of knowledge, culture, and practice, leaving behind a haunting landscape filled with traces of lives once fully engaged with the frozen world around them. Pripyat, the modern ghost city. In the shadow of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the city of Pripyat stands frozen in time, a modern settlement emptied almost overnight. Founded in 1970 to house the workers of the nearby reactor and their families, Pripyat was a thriving city of nearly 50, zero residents by 1986. Streets were lined with apartment blocks, schools and shops, and the city's theatres, swimming pools and amusement parks reflected a carefully planned urban life. Life followed the rhythms of work, school, and community events, with children playing in courtyards and neighbours gathering in cafes and public spaces. For 16 years, Pripyat grew and prospered, embodying the promise of Soviet progress, until one morning, life came to an abrupt halt. On April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl reactor number 4 exploded, sending radioactive material into the surrounding environment. For residents of Pripyat, the danger was invisible and immediate. Within hours, evacuation orders were issued, and families were instructed to leave their homes, carrying only what they could grab. Some were told it would be temporary, a few days until the situation was under control. In reality, no one would return. The city emptied quickly, leaving behind meals on tables, coats hanging in closets, and personal items scattered across bedrooms. The streets that had once carried the sounds of daily life fell silent, overtaken by wind, dust, and the occasional bird. Every corner of Pripyat bears witness to the abruptness of its abandonment. Classrooms still contain textbooks and toys left in haste, and playgrounds are frozen mid-play, swings and slides rusting but intact. Vehicles were left parked as if the drivers intended to return at any moment. Apartment windows reveal curtains still hanging, furniture in place, and family photographs resting on shelves. There was no looting or destruction in the immediate aftermath. The city simply stopped functioning, an urban life suspended under invisible contamination. Radiation spread unpredictably across the area, and zones once bustling with human activity became hazardous within hours. The evacuation forced entire communities to scatter across Ukraine and Belarus, fracturing social networks and displacing children from schools and neighborhoods where they had grown up. Health authorities tried to assess exposure and provide care, but the scale of the disaster meant that families lost homes, jobs, and routines almost simultaneously. Pripyat became a symbol of abrupt modern catastrophe, a city that fell not to war, fire, or natural disaster, but to an invisible force that left no structure unmarked. Even now, Pripyat remains eerily complete, yet the forces of nature over the decades have reshaped every corner. Nature has begun to reclaim the city. Trees grow through apartment floors, vines crawl over walls, and animals roam streets that once thronged with people. The decay is gradual but unmistakable, a slow reclamation that contrasts with the rapidity of the human departure. Tourists and researchers can walk through empty schools, hospitals and theatres, witnessing the frozen echoes of everyday life, signs of daily activity, abandoned abruptly, remind visitors of the suddenness with which an entire city can vanish from human hands. How a whole city came to be abandoned is vividly illustrated by Pripyat, where human error and technology collided. Unlike ancient cities that fell to conquest, fire, or environmental pressures, Pripyat's disappearance was immediate, dictated by the invisible threat of radiation. Yet the city's structures, its streets, and its possessions provide a detailed record of urban life, revealing routines, leisure activities, and domestic habits frozen in time. Each apartment block and public building is a monument to what was lost within a single day, capturing the fragility of human settlement even in the 20th century. The silence that pervades Pripyat today is almost tangible to anyone wandering its streets. Crumbling walls and rusted playgrounds contrast with remnants of vibrant life, posters on walls, abandoned bicycles, and faded toys scattered across courtyards. The city offers a stark lesson in vulnerability, showing how a community can disappear almost instantly, leaving behind a landscape that is both familiar and alien. Pripyat's frozen streets tell a story of modern civilization interrupted, a sudden fall witnessed not through destruction, but through the eerie stillness of a city left to the passage of time, contamination, and the quiet, reclaiming force of nature.